Hello and welcome to a little explanation of something that we released not too long ago. My name is Louw, and I have with me two friends. One of them is David Hamstra, and the other one is Dr. Michael Campbell. So I'll let you both introduce yourselves a little bit more, and then we will explain ourselves with this chart that we produced recently.
Hi, I'm David Hamstra. I am a pastor in Canada, or a COVID pastor, I might call myself in these times. Getting much more into this kind of media projects than I had ever wanted to before. And I also am a PhD in theological and historical studies student at Andrews University, trying to finish up that program while I'm here in the field.
And hi, I'm Michael Campbell. I teach religion at Southwestern Adventist University in Texas, and been there. This is my third year, and just really enjoying working with theology students and continuing to be engaged in ministry.
Awesome. Well, we're here as a bunch of pastors and professors and teachers to just share a little bit about some of the thoughts that have been roaming around our heads as we put this together. This kind of spread a little bit more rapidly than maybe we at first anticipated. And it's been fun to see people kind of enjoy perusing through some of the ideas, familiar with some perhaps, but probably unfamiliar with others. And so we thought we would just give a little recap as to what this is all about so that you can have a better understanding of Adventist history, our heritage, and maybe even some things that have less to do with us than they should. So with that said, I'm going to zoom into the bottom and we will start with definitions and we will go from there. And I'll read the two definitions and then I'll hand it over to the other guys to share a little bit more about some of the specifics. So we have three definitions here that will be helpful as we move forward. Number one, for one of the sections, we have publicly verified, and we're just defining that as something requiring direct evidence, open documentation, third-party research, and independent review. So that's our understanding of publicly verified. As we go through the rest of the chart, there's kind of a sliding scale from what's very verified and verifiable to things that are maybe more speculative or unable to be verified. We would call those non-falsifiable in some cases as well. Other definitions: a conspiracy is a collaborative plot that would be stopped if publicly known. Not to be confused with a conspiracy theory, which we define as a theory about how a conspiracy has occurred or is taking place. This is key and crucial to differentiate. David may expand further on that, but I'll hand it over to both of you as we look at the first section here at the bottom.
And while you're going into that first section, I just wanted to kind of mention a little bit that we kind of got the idea from a similar chart that people have done of other kinds of conspiracy theories, but what we've tried to do is to try to apply these same kinds of ideas specifically to Adventist conspiracy theories. It's not to say that there aren't these same kinds of things that exist elsewhere, but what we're trying to do is look at it in an Adventist context, meaning that some Adventists have some specifically Adventist approach or view to these different things that we're going to discuss.
For sure. So some of those may relate to like vaccination or the King James Version as the best version, or some of these other ideas that have more of an Adventist take on them as a subset of maybe that broader topic in society.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, take us away, David. We'll start at the bottom.
Yeah. So public verification, it's not necessarily needed to have, any kind of knowledge, I think, right? There are some things that we might believe as Seventh-day Adventists that others wouldn't consider to be publicly verified. But here, when we're in this realm, we're not talking about like tenets of the faith or things like this, right? We're really looking at what has happened like in history, in the past or in the present. And so it's, I think, important to hold to those standards of public verification, especially when we're going to come up and really proclaim something to have been the case that it happened in history. because we want to, I think, build our presentations as Seventh-day Adventists on things that people can generally agree took place. And, then from there, we can have credibility when we talk to them about, things that are more specific to our beliefs. I don't know if you wanted to add anything on that point, Michael.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head. There's a sliding scale, but these ones here in the bottom, at some point, again, there's been talk about them over time. For example, the Wyatt Estate Z file. At some point, it did really actually exist, and while there may be some debate as to maybe which letters were in that Z file or specific aspects of that, but we do know that was there at one point, and that can be documented.
Right. And so then maybe we could use that as an illustration to talk about what's a conspiracy, right? Like, it's a plot that would be stopped if people knew about it. Sometimes the mere fact of the knowledge is enough to stop the plot, right? If the conspiracy is to hide a secret or something like this.
Yeah.
And in this way, the Z file does seem to be kind of a benign conspiracy, depending on your view of it, right? It seemed like they're really just trying to protect people's reputations. But a sort of a conspiracy nonetheless. And then there could be a theory about how this conspiracy has taken place that we've publicly verified. I mean, the people who were involved have come out and said, yeah, this is what happened. Here's why. And now all the documents that were in that Z file are available for public view.
Yeah. So I'm gathering that this was a file that was secretly hidden and held back from the general public, for those who may not be aware.
Yeah, so it's a restricted file. Z was placed on the top of the letter, and most of those letters we now know today were either to family members of Ellen White, James and Ellen White, or were related to the 1888 Minneapolis General Conference session. So it was kind of very controversial, very heated, and so there's a lot of sensitive feelings. And so Ellen White, or her successors, I should say, in the Wyatt estate, felt it was important not to embarrass certain people. So there's some reasonable explanations, but you can also see why people might wonder, is there something hidden? Is there something secretive there? And so that's where, we're trying to actually go in, and this ends up being, I think, a pretty good case study or an example, like you said, David, of a fairly benign kind of conspiracy, especially now that we're looking back quite a ways, where the Z file, I think, was decommissioned in the latter part of the 1980s. So it's been quite some time that all of those documents in the Z file are now easily accessible to everyone. But there was a time when it wasn't, and of course there are reasons why. But you can also understand why there might be some questions that people had too.
Yeah, and as the Adventist history expert, I really expect Michael to speak to most of these ones here in the bottom portion. I think, this is really your wheelhouse, but I just want to also say, it's from what I understand, there were also testimonies that Ellen White wrote to people who were involved in various sexual sins, right? And, having that all come out would have really perhaps embarrassed their children or things like that. Now that the people have passed away, it's not such a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And, you can kind of see why, if there might be a prominent church leader all the way back in the 70s or 80s, where I remember when I started working at the Wyatt Estate as an intern in the early 90s, meeting a number of different people who said, oh, my grandparents were the ones that Ellen White wrote this testimony to. But, it was kind of a very strong testimony, and it's not exactly very nice if Ellen White writes a letter and says, I saw you sleeping with so-and-so. That's not exactly the kind of Adventist history that we like to necessarily always brag to our friends. Guess what kind of letter my grandfather or grandmother got?
Nice. Well, for the sake of time, let's look at some of these others as well. Who wants to take a stab? I can just pick them as we go, and then you can speak up, or you can select your favorites so we can go through there. Let's start with maybe racial quotas for now. That may be somewhat self-explanatory, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think they were referring to Adventist schools and kind of the civil rights era that would have been like on paper open to anybody, but in reality they would only accept a certain number of colored students, and then your application was going to be rejected no matter what. that's been documented.
Yeah, and I've interviewed a couple of pastors that another way of looking at that is conferences, where they had a proverbial one black pastor and that one slot was filled. So, other applicants, again, that were of that background were turned away and basically said, well, we have our, again, quota.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Washburn and Holmes, Smear Daniels.
Well, I guess I'll start out on this one. But basically in the 1920s, the late 19 teens and 20s, Claude Holmes and J.S. Washburn were kind of some of the most vociferous individuals that were really just believed that A.G. Daniels, the church president, was no good. He was undermining the spirit of prophecy. And so what they did is they basically got all of Ellen White's unpublished testimonies without permission and then asked Daniels to resign, and of course he refused, and they spent the rest of their careers trying to destroy his leadership. And so they were vociferous. They wrote many pamphlets, and again, that's they say the rest is history. There's a lot of documentation on this.
Yeah. Okay. The one that caught my attention the most out of this whole section is the next one. Fake Ellen White letter endorses a prophetic successor. Wait, what?
All right, I'll go back to this one, I guess, since this is my wheelhouse. But basically, Margaret Rowan was probably the most famous example of someone who claimed to be Ellen White's prophetic successor. There's been quite a number of them. Someday I hope to write a book on it. They're called the Almost Adventist Prophets. Anyways, she basically, as time went on, began to make greater and greater claims until she finally wrote to church leaders and said, hey, if you look in the files of the White estate, you'll see that there is a letter signed by Ellen White designating her to be her prophetic successor. And sure enough, when they actually looked in the White estate files, there was the letter. So the question was, how did the letter get there? And later it came out that one of her most loyal followers, he had been duped into believing that the letter actually was there. Margaret Rowan had first been there, and the Lord revealed it to her in vision. So she had gone up to Elmshaven, had taken the letter as proof of that prophetic calling, and only to, and so gives him the letter as he's been tasked by the Lord to put it back in the file, not realizing what had happened. Anyways, it later comes out because she tries to kill him. It's a murder plot. He actually ends up dying. He's poisoned, and it's quite a long saga. But yes, we have the letter. It's an obvious forgery. I could give you about 30 reasons why, but it's one of the more unusual stories in Adventist history. And again, now thanks to time, we have quite a bit of documentation and even the written confession from the person who shared how he ended up being duped into putting the letter there. So that's the fun of historical research, is that handwritten confession was recently discovered this past summer.
Nice. So this cutting edge. The next one is kind of related ideologically. James Garmire steals a Review and Herald mailing list to publish his daughter's visions.
Well, back again to people wanting to claim that prophetic mantle. This was back in the 1880s, where James Garmire is actually in Colorado, and his daughter starts having visions. So he starts promoting his daughter. It's sort of 40 years since 1844. So he sees this as a sign of the end, that Christ is coming, this 40-year cycle. And so in order to make sure that the church knows about his prophetic, his daughter in her visions breaks into the Review and Herald, steals the mailing list. Ellen White actually sits down and meets with him and his daughter and has some words of admonition. And it turns out later that he was abusing his daughter and that she actually ends up getting pregnant. It's a long, sordid whole story, but again, it's verifiable and documented. But these are some of the more unusual stories, I think, in Adventist history.
Yeah. All right, we have David Koresh and the Bronze Davidian offshoots. That's fairly well known, but I think both of them still exist to this day in some other form. Not very large, but it's certainly a documented fact.
When I take students down to Baylor to go research, they always want to see that and see the compound and the memorial that's there.
And I think the conspiracy there is that they have used sort of evangelistic tactics, which involve essentially infiltrating Adventist churches in order to sort of peel off members for their offshoot. And I think from their perspective, they would see it as bringing a prophetic warning to us in whatever way we might hear it. But it is kind of conspiratorial in the way that if it was known who they were, they wouldn't be able to use that methodology.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so now we get to what's known as the speculation line. David, do you want to share a little bit about what we mean by speculation line?
Well, it's just, I think the circle says it nicely, right? We have questions, right? Not everything that's speculative is false, but it's not all true. It's kind of in that gray zone of knowledge where there's enough smoke to infer a fire, but if you haven't seen the fire, you know what I mean? You can't really say for sure, right? So, we're leaving verified, publicly verified reality here. And there may be people with inside knowledge who would say, yeah, I do know for sure that something has gone on, right? But they cannot demonstrate it to the public in such a way that we can also say, yeah, without questions, we know for sure it's going on. Mm-hmm. I would put it that way.
Sure. So one of probably the bigger issues out of this whole section here would be like elective abortions in Adventist hospitals. This has been something that different people have kind of rallied along, and there's some evidence that makes it look like that may be the case, and then there's other evidence that says no, like this generally isn't happening except in extreme medical necessitated type situations. So yeah, I mean it's still within plausibility.
Yeah, and it's hard to know because elective abortion isn't necessarily a statistic that our hospital networks track, right? And and then when you're in that kind of bureaucratic ambiguity, things could happen that aren't necessarily authorized. So, what exactly is happening there? And maybe the answer to the question is to bring in some more controls over the situation, right? And just look at going forward. How do we want to proceed? And then there's a whole abortion debate within Adventism. Some people are very hardline on that. Others are, looser, and then still others are just totally open, in certain places. So, yeah, this has been addressed in public meetings, right, that I've watched where people have gone up and given the statistics. But, there's still, I still have some questions. I'm not exactly sure what is going on there.
Yeah, warrants further study, as many of these do. Okay, padded membership stats is right at the bottom there. Who wants to share on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. When we posted this graphic right away, several people attacked this one, that are you really sure? We've done audits of church membership, and I tagged David Trim right away, who's our General Conference archives and statistics person, and he kind of indicated very diplomatically, but basically there's still quite a bit of work to do on this one. So where in some parts of the world, I know they've been trying to do audits, but the reality is that, and I've experienced this in different parts of the world in my travels where supposedly there are tens of thousands of church members, but when I talk to the actual pastors, they say, well, we have lots of people that show up for a rally, but really in the end, there's just not the same numbers that are on the books. And so, and that can, there's different reasons why that can be. Who doesn't want to say that we have X number of members in a certain country or a certain region of the world? But is it actually always accurate? So we still are left with some of these questions, and which raises also the question of how do you get those accurate numbers? Church membership is always going to be a little bit different than the actual number of people that show up on any given Sabbath. So how to actually get the accuracy is honestly, it's a challenge. So
it is. Something I've noticed is that one of the ministries that is often the least active is the reclaiming ministry of a church. How many people are going out and reclaiming members that maybe haven't shown up in years, or maybe an address has been lost and it's hard to get in contact. I mean, these are things that happen unintentionally, or it may happen intentionally in some pockets, but it's hard to verify, and we definitely have more questions. So let's talk about voting blocks.
Yeah, so you have yeah, you have reports of people at general conference sessions seeing church leaders standing up and telling their delegates to vote this way, on this item that's come forward and that kind of thing.
Yep.
And there may be cultural differences in terms of how people handle that voting responsibility. Although by policy, you're not supposed to tell other people how to vote in these meetings, right? But then you wonder, well, why would there be a need for secret balloting on certain select issues if it was not a problem all the way along, right?
Yep.
And I guess for me, when I look at this one, I say, yeah, it probably does go on, but at the same time, we have a church polity which traces its roots back to small town councils in New England, right? And how well does our governance structure fit like a multicultural church, and our governance processes fit a multicultural church? So I have questions, right? It's people say does it happens, but is it really that nefarious? Is it really conspiratorial, right? Our jobs on the line if people don't vote a certain way, who knows, right?
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Then we have two others relating to universities. We have plagiarism of dissertations at Adventist universities.
Yeah. Well, this is the challenge. And again, this comes back to, as I think David mentioned, there's cultural expectations where in some cultures it's considered a compliment to use someone else's work, but how much of that work is actually original? And so, and I think where this came to the forefront was a division president some years ago that found out that some of his dissertation work was clearly lifted from another source, and that prompted ultimately his stepping down from that position of leadership. And upon doing a little bit more careful inspection, it seems like there was a pattern in some institutions where there were other materials, other dissertations that came to light as a part of that. So there's questions how extensive it is. I think still, I think we have a sound educational system overall, but there are times where perhaps some less than best practices have crept in. And so, again, there are measures in place for accountability. Could those measures have been stronger, or do they still need to be strengthened, are questions that still can be, I think, asked. And, it's back to we've got some questions that, at least in my mind, that haven't been fully resolved, but that it can be a challenge, and like a lot of these things, it's complicated.
Mm-hmm. All right, infidel professors.
Yeah, so I could tell stories here, right? But I think that's the point, is that just because people can tell stories doesn't mean that something's publicly verified. Okay, so I'm not going to tell the stories. Okay, I'm just going to point to the issue, which is that I think broadly, when someone goes to study in higher education, right? It's a challenging time for your faith. You learn a lot, you grow a lot. Some people grow farther away from what I would consider to be the core of Adventism than others, but then they still need to have a job at the end of the day. And they come back and will teach in our schools. And I think the question is then, how do you handle this situation, right? I would say that the professor I learned the most from in my undergrad experience was also the one everybody thought was a heretic, right? At the same time, some people say he destroyed others' faith, right? And those kinds of things. Maybe their faith would have been destroyed anyways. So it's a challenging thing, and the other problem is then if you get into sort of a purge mentality, right? When it comes to these things, it creates an environment that really closes us off to theological growth, and it becomes all about just protecting certain positions in the past. So I think, again, I have questions, and more than that, it's one of those things where I'd like to see something done going forward, see professors take more responsibility in their collegial relationships at the universities to look at how can we, even though we all have questions, right? How can we build Adventist faith among our students in a way that is consistent with what the church professes to teach? And then, what are the lines where somebody should really just be honest and find another line of work, right? Questions. Yeah. I don't know if you want to have anything to add to that, Michael. You're actually doing it.
Right. Yeah. I hope I'm orthodox.
Right.
But yeah. And the thing is, and I really appreciate, I had a good friend of mine, one of my very close friends. We went through our graduate studies, and eventually when he got done, he was teaching for a few years, and he had a loss of faith. And to his credit, what I really admire is he resigned his position. He said, well, give me just a little bit to transition and find my way. And he did. He didn't make a big stink about it. In fact, I think most people probably would never know whatever happened. But I appreciate someone like that had the integrity to step aside. So there's, and so there are protocols in place, but do they always work? Well, not necessarily. That's why we have questions. But in best case scenario, I've certainly seen it work well. But again, there's a human dimension where, as David mentioned, people, each person's on their own spiritual religious journey, and that means that professors on their own spiritual journey, where you have highs and lows, and that's just reality, because professors are real human beings.
Yeah, for sure. Closing of the Review and Herald.
You better go toward this one, Michael. I'm not really qualified on this one.
Well, some years ago, I should have actually looked this up, but 10, 15 years ago, whatever it was, the review was closed, and that is the publishing, Physical Publishing Association there in Hagerstown, Maryland. I've talked to some of the administrators who said, hey, we're at the bank, we had a financial plan to turn the place around, and then there was this big public announcement from the GC that really kind of sidelined everybody that it's closing. And of course, once it was publicly announced they were closing, the bank said, well, we're not going to give you money now. So it kind of ended any feasible plan of turning the review around. That's not to say that it wouldn't have ultimately closed anyways, and they wouldn't have been able to turn around, but there wasn't really a very public or transparent process that I was able to really see. And very may well have been justifiable, but that's why we put this in the one that kind of we have questions. It didn't seem to be as clear to me, at least, as what it maybe could have.
And then you basically bring the imprint directly under general conference control, right? And it doesn't have...
Yeah, so there's still this imprimatur, and occasionally you'll see a publication come with it. But yeah, it's basically, this has become the imprimatur of any official denominational publication. But as a publishing house, it's basically effectively ceased to really exist.
Yeah, so now we're at a little bit of an impasse, because this next one, I'm not sure we have any expertise on this next subject. So, we might just have to skip it. Just kidding.
I might have to let David handle this one. I might be a little passionate about it.
You're gonna see how well I've studied your work, right?
Right, David.
Okay, challenge accepted. So the 1919 Bible Conference minutes end up in the GC files, and they're just gone, like out of church consciousness for basically 50 years, right, or more. Till Bertolowiak, I think it was, discovers them again, and then it kind of fell on the church. The stuff about Ellen White and the things in those last 2 days, I think his last 2 days, right, were published in Spectrum magazine, and sort of came as a bombshell, like, oh man, all these questions that we're dealing with Walter Ray and these guys, they thought about that years ago and nobody knew, right? So was it like deliberately suppressed because it was too hot to handle, or were they just simply, was it forgotten about? Was there a conspiracy to suppress them? I suppose, is that a fair way of putting it, Michael?
I think you summarized it very, very well, very succinctly. Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is as best as I can tell with all my research, it was just put in the basement of the GC and forgotten about. And there were excerpts of it that were published. W.W. Prescott's sermons were published. And it looks like people were obviously using some of these materials. But it does seem like there was a concern by administrators, let's kind of calm the controversy and calm things down. And the danger is something like that it gets forgotten. And I mean, one could always wish. This is the challenge of history, right? We could go back in time, and if we could have sensitized them, if you just paid a little more attention here, what a difference you could have made. And but then again, that's one of those things. Would it have really mattered or changed things if they had published it? That's speculative. We just don't know. We don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, great summary. I mean, I could go on and on about this one. I
You wrote a whole book about it, and then some.
Right.
Might as well give it a plug.
Yeah, you got your recent book out in 1919, right?
That's right.
Go buy it, read it with Pacific Press, I'm guessing.
Yeah, that's right. Pacific Press, the one remaining publishing house there. So here in North America, but yeah, it came out about a little over a year ago. And so if you want all the skinny on 1919, go check that out.
Okay. So now we're leaving plausible reality, and this is defined as a sensationalized spin of verified facts. So there may be some facts, there may be some data here, but the key here is that it has been sensationalized, it's been twisted, it's been changed a little bit. Would you be comfortable with that definition, David, or do you want to add some more?
Let's go in.
Okay. So, well, let's start with the biggest one since it's right there. Now, this will not be a treatment of the topic in detail, but we'll just explain what we're referring to. So KJV only.
Well, the conspiracy theory there is that, infidel scholars have conspired to take verses out of your Bible, right? And the Adventist concern about other translations besides the King James Version has to do with Hebrews and the Holy of Holies and those kinds of things, right? On that, I would refer, the last point, I would refer people to the work of Richard Davidson on the sanctuary, and how Jesus actually did enter into the Holy of Holies when he ascended to his Father, and why that's important within biblical typology. It doesn't undo 1844. And then on the other point, I would just say, and in fact, I just walked my church members on Sabbath afternoon through a couple classes on this, on how we establish the text of the New Testament. And really what happened is in the 18th century, whether they're infidels or Christians or not, is scholars were able to find earlier and earlier documents that support what the original text of the New Testament was. And what they found is that when scribes copy texts, they usually have a tendency to add things rather than subtract things.
Yeah.
And you find that because you can date the text based on, there's a whole field of scholarship in this. You could, look into that yourself. But essentially, no, it wasn't a conspiracy to take things out of the Bible. It was actually people trying to figure out what was originally there in the first place. But now I have to make this point always when I do this. That doesn't mean that the King James Version isn't God's word, or that these manuscripts that have additions, and these, it's all God's word. But when we go to do serious Bible study and ground our truths as seriously as possible in what we can establish from history, then this sort of stuff becomes important.
Yeah, I always maintain to people who come to me and say KJV only, I say, well, I really believe that just reading the original manuscripts is the best, but we don't have the original, the handwritten writings of the apostles and the Bible authors. So we do the best that we can, and we read the Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, and whatever else we can, and see what matches up. So it's not an exact science, and something that I learned during my study of Greek and Hebrew is that there is a degree of flexibility. One word in Greek or Hebrew can be translated into an entire phrase or even sometimes a sentence in the English language. So it's not that simple, and it bears further discussion and study. Yeah. All right, we have spiritual formation equals spiritualism.
Well, this one's a fun one. I'll dive in on this one. When I was a student in undergrad back in the 90s, I'm dating myself here a bit, but I had one of my religion professors, Derek Morris, who's now at Hope Channel, and I remember there's this lady that would always parade it seemed like on a regular basis, these signs that she had made some secret discovery that the religion professors, especially Dr. Morris, was some kind of infiltrator and was teaching spiritual formation, so therefore he was a heretic. And she at one point had gotten a copy of his syllabus on spiritual formation, and a lot of the points that she was trying to make and attack him with were actually, as I sat in the class, the things he was telling us, oh, this is not what we do. He was actually warning us against them, but because she had some notes or something and she didn't have the context, this to her became proof that religion teachers were teaching spiritual formation. And often I find this is the case. And there's some confusion between Eastern meditation. This is what people, Adventist religion professors, that they're teaching kind of Eastern mysticism meditation. And when I've taught world religions, I always point out that Eastern mysticism and meditation usually is focused on emptying the mind, and true spiritual, biblical formation, if you please, if you want to even use that term, is really about filling the mind with God's word and prayer. And so it's actually quite the opposite. But ironically, I find there's a lot of people that attack Adventist teachers, Adventist thought leaders on spiritual formation, not realizing actually what they're really attacking, or sometimes they're actually both in agreement that neither side would be promoting any kind of Eastern mysticism or meditation in any form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the irony with some of these things is that if there was actually concrete evidence, it wouldn't necessarily be a conspiracy in many cases. I've heard the same things rallied about some of the professors I studied under, and it was just
right. Yeah,
we were differentiating between some of these things, not studying them. So okay, La Sierra leaving.
Yeah, so there was an incident, I don't know, it must be about a decade now back, where some professors and administrators at La Sierra decided to tape record a conversation with a church administrator to try to get some dirt on the person, and ended up leaving the recorder on and recorded themselves watching a basketball game, imbibing beverages that they should not have been, and talking about how the school could get detached from the denomination. And then they sent this recording to somebody to, say how awful this church administrator was, and they didn't realize that they also sent the rest, right? So these people were let go, and that was, pretty much the end of it. But then, people would say, well, this is really evidence of a much grander plot to, get our schools out of the denomination, or things like of this nature. And that just seems to me to be a bit sensationalized, because the problem was identified and dealt with. So I don't know much more to say about that point.
Yeah. Another big one is Ecumenical Delusion. This is one that I've run into at some points in my ministry, almost every church I've been to. So this is another big one. Someone tackle it.
There's a number of strands here.
So many.
The first is that maybe I'll go to Europe first. Okay, there seems to be an Adventist culture in Europe which wants to pitch Adventism as like the culmination of the Reformation. That's the evangelistic selling point, and so and of course in Europe as well, the continent had been wrecked by religious wars and churches inserting themselves too much into politics and things like this. So there's a very big drive for ecumenism there. And certain pastors, have been quite open to those kinds of meetings and dialogues, and will even make statements or sign things, that seem to implicate the church in ecumenism, right? And Adventists are always quite careful to maintain our distinctive identity, right? We will have conversations with people of all different faiths. We will have often extended dialogues between our scholars and scholars of other churches, explaining where we stand on various issues, so we can get the points of disagreement correct. But we've even sent observers to ecumenical councils and things of this nature. Adventist scholars have served on different groups, helping to clarify where do we stand, what do we have in common, what do we have in difference. But the idea that the church is going to get taken over by the ecumenical movement because of these things, I think is without evidence, right? It's quite sensationalized. The pastors and administrators who might push the church in those directions in Europe, they always encounter pushback. It always seems to come back in certain ways. I don't know if you have anything to add on that based on your broader experiences or anything of that nature.
I would just add one other thing there. I was studying for a paper I was writing on church authority and the development of our union structure. And I came across some writings in several different books. It was actually describing, it was a Baptist book describing Seventh-day Baptists and their organizational structure. And in it, I found these notes saying that there were individuals named J.N. Andrews and James Wyatt and all these people that came to their general conferences year after year after year and had an open invitation to even present. And it was fascinating to me because I was like, whoa, we've been doing this right since the beginning. We've been going and interacting and sharing and dialoguing and seeking to win people, not to, an ecumenical agenda, but to a broader, greater understanding of truth. So this is really nothing that's particularly new in our denomination.
Yeah, and that tradition of Seventh-day Baptists coming to GC session continues to this day.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. William Miller was a Freemason. I first ran into this one in undergrad. One of my professors said, he had people connecting with him and giving him flack over this idea that our pioneers were Freemasons. Look, here's a picture of them with their hand in their jacket a certain way. So
oh my.
It's clearly a conspiracy that Freemasons are taking over the church right from the beginning, right? Anyone want to speak more to this?
Sure, I guess I'll go for this one. The fact is that at one point William Miller was a Freemason, and it was a very popular movement in the 19th century, and sort of a social kind of organization. And while there have been obviously the Freemasonry movement has ebbed and flowed through the decades and even the last several centuries, that was just a popular thing. But what the significant thing is that William Miller renounced his Freemason ways. As he became an Adventist, he found that to be somewhat distracting, and we have a copy in his handwriting where he basically resigned from his association from Freemasonry. So I think that's where historical context is really important to realize, hey, our pioneers had a specific context, and just because he was a Freemason at one point doesn't denigrate or make him a bad person. And certainly he grew in his understanding, which I think is an important aspect of Adventism, is that flexibility to allow people to grow.
And I think that illustrates how once you get into a certain level of dot connecting in conspiracy theories, Adventism can become part of the conspiracy.
Yeah.
And in fact, in the end, Christianity, I've seen people take this trajectory where Christianity in the end becomes a part of the conspiracy. It's a religion set up by the Romans to control the Jews. Jesus never existed, right? So, it can really be quite destructive to your faith in those ways.
Yeah, for sure. Questions on doctrine apostasy. This is another big topic in the Adventist Church.
Oh man, this is so big that it's hard to summarize succinctly, but I would say it really was a conspiracy theory from the very start with M.L. Andreasen, right? The idea that the church leadership had met with these Calvinist evangelicals and had just compromised the essence of the Adventist faith on the issue of the atonement. And then connecting the nature of Christ into that. Now, there was a misrepresentation about the nature of Christ and what Adventists mainly believed about it at the time that happened in the book Questions on Doctrine. But I think they actually got the atonement right. They were just using different language than what Andreasen was used to, and he overreacted. In part also because they didn't really consult with him on it, and he felt like he should have been consulted. And so, it's kind of like the original viral conspiracy theory in Adventism, right? Like he sent out these letters and people mimeographed them or whatever it was at the time and spread them around. This idea that the church had kind of capitulated and apostatized on its core teaching in that book. I don't know if you want to add something to that, Michael. This is, again, kind of in your wheelhouse.
No, I think that you got a really great summary. Yeah, this is a very common one that I've run across in my pastoral ministry experience, where if people see this as sort of a major turning point in the church moving towards apostasy, this is oftentimes where they will point to right away. But often, kind of the rest of the story isn't always told. For example, M.L. Andreasen had a reconciliation with the church. I mean, it actually got so vociferous that he lost his credentials for a while and so on. But there was this reconciliation. And so while QOD, as it's often called, is a significant controversial turning point, it's also kind of important to look at all of the history, all of the story, and not just frame it in some kind of way and spin it in a way that makes it look to justify someone's own theological agenda. So I've seen a lot of groups that have left the church and they use it on this pretext. And when you actually ask them to explain QOD or the history there, they really don't even have their basic facts straight. So yes, it was controversial, but make sure you actually understand the controversy. And if you really want some good background on how all this happened, I think this has been well received by both the right and the left. On both sides, the extreme sides that were centered on this as being controversial. George Knight's edited edition of Questions on Doctrine, published by Andrews University Press, is really a consummate summary and a very articulate, detailed description of how all of this took place. So I'd encourage those that are curious to refer to that as a great source for more information.
Yeah.
That one also illustrates to me the danger of doing all your communication via letters.
Yes.
It's, when they finally sat down face to face, things got sorted out.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
it's true.
How much is how much are so many of these things a breakdown of just basic communication?
I wonder today how many of the controversies we have in the present time could be solved through maybe some of those same things. Our pioneers, they would stay up till midnight studying the Bible, and if they reach an impasse, they go apart, pray a bit, come back together. What would that look like for some of the controversies today and whatnot? I think it would make a huge difference rather than mudslinging back and forth.
And coming back to the spiritual formation, what if that person, instead of holding a sign protesting on the street, had actually gone to that religion teacher teaching spiritual formation and said, "Hey, I'd really like to understand what you're teaching on this topic. I have some concerns." I bet that could have actually saved so much unrest and anxiety.
Yeah. Something I often hear is rallied. It's like, nope, this was published on a public forum, therefore it will be rebuked publicly. And that would be great if it was fully understood. But in 99% of the cases, there's a lack of understanding and there's a disconnect that causes the reaction to not be at all proportionate to whatever it is that catalyzed that reaction. So, okay, well, let's move on. Pandemic shutdowns are dry runs for the mark of the beast.
Yeah. And let me not laugh too much on that point, right? Because we do live in times that feel very apocalyptic. And, we're certainly seeing some unprecedented forms of government control. But I think what we're trying to get at here with the idea that, any kind of compliance, right, is like capitulation and setting you up to compromise your faith in the end times, right? And, it just simply seems to me to be not the case. We have biblical warrant for complying with quarantines and those kinds of things, right? I think we need to, think through where do we take stands, right? And not receive persecution because we are not on the side of the right. Now that's not to justify shutdowns, right? I mean, shutdowns are extremely disruptive, have lots of bad side effects. But I lean more pro shutdown, but I see the arguments against. My point is that it's not a compromise of your Adventist faith to comply with government authority in that regard. And it doesn't have to, be like, the Pope and the president are getting together planning for this, and here, well, we're ascending to a higher tier now with that reference. But, to see it as a dry run for the mark of the beast, I think is excessive.
Yeah. No, as I look at this one, I recognize that we are living in the end of Earth's history. We believe Jesus is coming soon. So we don't want to belittle that in any way. At the same time, we recognize that this could be a time for many people to awake out of, spiritual proverbial sleep and come to a closer walk with Christ. So that's tremendous. And I think there is a function there that God uses and remedies bad things for good. But yeah, this isn't necessarily something that we could concretely say, this is a dry run for sure.
And now the end of our Sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Oh, no. Okay, so now we transition into a whole different plane of discussion. We're going from things that are leaving plausible reality to being baptized occult. Now, I think this bears a little bit more explanation than some of the previous ones because it could be easily misunderstood. What do we mean by baptized occult?
Yeah, that sort of is an expression that I've come up with based on an article that I had in Advindicate, which is an Adventist website. By occult, I'm talking about, kind of going back toward a movement in the 18th century that, was sort of romantic in nature, I guess you could say, right? Which felt like that Enlightenment rationality had kind of quashed our ability to be fully human, right? And so we're, as far as science and history and all that stuff goes, that's good for the ordinary person. But if you tap into these, special words, and symbols, you can arrive at special power, right? And get in a different and higher plane of reality and operate on that level, right? And so what I find is that the Adventist conspiracy preachers who are most obsessed by the occult seem also to have adopted and baptized that occult worldview, and that you can get along with the ordinary methods of history and science to your religion, and that's okay. But when you really want to figure out what's really going on, right, then you got to get into this world of symbols and certain extreme forms of science denial. I think we could even put into that occult worldview category, because it's like, that's for the ordinary people what we know what's really going on. So that's sort of what I mean by, like, there's a hidden world out there that you can uncover through symbols. That's the occult worldview.
Yeah, a lot of that also has to do with the idea that there is I hesitate to use the term, but like a sacramental kind of power to things. In a sacramental worldview, you think of doing things to actually earn or achieve something that would not otherwise be possible. And so a lot of these can sometimes be misconstrued as, well, I did my symbolic act, now there's a symbolic result or a physical, literal result that is to occur. And because of that understanding, sometimes you think, well, triangles, there's a power in the symbol, and we need to watch out about that. I was once going door to door, and one of my friends was with me, and they were really concerned because they noticed a symbol on a building. And they said, well, no, this is someone who clearly worships a different being or is in a secret society, and I really shouldn't go to that house. And it was a fear response rather than a salvific wanting to reach others response. So it bears just, I think, having that foundation as we move forward. So let's start out with one of the ones I've heard the most, probably out of this whole bunch. Well, it's probably a tie, but Christmas and Easter sneak in paganism.
Well, I just wrote an article on this that will be coming out in a couple of weeks. So, but there's a new Oxford Handbook of Christmas that was just released, literally just earlier this month. And it's interesting because I just hear lots of association with Christmas and Easter, that these are just pagan holidays, and so therefore they are evil. And so if you are to observe them, then therefore you are a lesser Christian. And so there's a lot of that taking place. And And yet, when you actually look at the historical evidence to really prove that, it's just not there. And this is what the recent Oxford Handbook's showing, is a lot of the which pagan calendar do you actually use to actually prove that? There's no reliable pagan calendar. A lot of the dates don't really even match up. So there's just no good, credible historical evidence for that. It sounds very sensational when you hear it, but there's just not the historical evidence to back it up, and that's the reality. I like how Ellen White actually treated the whole topic. I thought it was very balanced. It may or may not have actually had pagan origins, but basically Christmas is what you make it, and it's up to you to make it focused on Christ and not to make it something very materialistic. And of course, she has her own verbiage and how she says that, but that basic idea. So let's, we have to be careful. But in this case, I think we're starting to leave real historical fact when we're, and it's not to say that if someone looked actually hard enough, they might have found someone in the ancient world that actually had some pagan holiday on that particular day, but it's kind of stretching the facts when you get to that.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the dating arguments are quite poor in this regard. Easter is obviously tied to Passover, and then interestingly, Christmas seems to be tied to Passover as well, but we don't have time to get into that. What I would point out is that there are customs associated with Christmas and Easter that seem to have, if not pagan origins, very materialistic origins in our current society. If somebody wants to conscientiously abstain from Christmas and Easter, I have no quarrel with them. It's the issue of, kind of looking at others as less than, as you said, or trying to say, now the whole church has to go the way I go, right? That's the problem here. And I guess what I'm really wanting to point out here is that just saying that because we can look at some associations in this regard, right, that to paganism, right, because those associations may be there, automatically it means this, right? That's that occult worldview where the symbol automatically means that no matter where we find it, right? And the fact is, historical context makes a difference in the meaning of symbols, and we have to interpret them that way.
I often ask the question, if a pagan climbed a tree once, does that mean that tree climbing is now, out of bounds, or is the use or misuse of something for evil? Is it redefining and renorming of that for all future use? And I think obviously in the biblical worldview, no, like God created, he is the foundation of many of the things that we see in nature. And, if there's a tree that is used, there's God created trees, what came first? But anyway, we digress by getting into too much detail if we're not careful. Let's go on Ellen White's grave.
I was about to just say, I think the best example, the same thing, is the same exact, obelisk having an ancient pagan association with Egypt and with ancient pagan as an ancient pagan symbol. But the reality is in the Victorian era, this was a very common practice and just a very respectable practice of way of marking the burial place of a loved one. And so you have James White that dies in 1881 and is buried there along with Ellen White's children. So they mark the family grave, the White family grave, with an obelisk. It clearly had no pagan association for any of the White family, especially James or Ellen White. They're buried there, and I think Ellen White would have seen it, most certainly knew she was being buried there, and that was her wish and desire, but certainly had no pagan. And so this kind of quick jump, like we've been talking about, between some kind of symbol and instantly we see it, and so then therefore hastily jumping the gun and saying, oh, therefore this is some kind of pagan proof. And it's not like that at all. It's just, it was a Victorian custom that you'll see on many tombstones from the late 19th century.
Yeah. So maybe we can tackle 3 of these at once. Circles as sun worship, triangles as Illuminati, and all of that culminating in the new logo is pagan.
The same exact issue, right? And I think there's a very interesting one with the new logo. Some people have seen an upside down cross in it. Yeah. Once you look for that, like it's something like it's sort of reading something into the negative space of the logo, which could be there, couldn't be there. So how do you determine what it actually means? Well, what do the people who put it together say it means, right? How is it being used, right? Look at those historical factors that will tell you what the symbol means. The same thing goes for circles and triangles, right? They don't automatically mean these things.
Yeah, I've got to watch out because I designed this chart, building it out here. It's an
So,
upside down
Eric,
triangle.
there might be some
No,
hidden meaning here, Eric.
I mean, it's an upside down triangle. What does that mean?
Oh, mercy.
So be careful of the hand gestures now.
And there's lots of circles on this chart too, Eric. Look at all the circles.
What are you doing, Eric?
Sun worship and the Illuminati combined.
Oh.
Okay, so moving on, we have, let's do homeopathy.
Yeah, now we're getting more into the science denial areas, right? Where again, now here's the big thing, right? People will accuse us, Adventists like myself, of science denial who believe in, a 7-day creation, right? Haven't we shown that? I think we're talking about different kinds of science here, right? Like, there's science that tries to go back and make inferences and reconstruct what happens in the past. Okay, fair enough. I think the farther you go away from, current life, the more there is room to question those kinds of inferences to the past. But with something like homeopathy, where the idea that a little bit of this thing will make this huge effect in your body, it just hasn't bared out in the best research. And then there's the other challenge here where Ellen White seems to have talked about homeopathy and allopathy and those kinds of things, right? But I from what I can read, she is using that term in a very different way than how it's practiced with homeopathic medicine, right? She seems to be referring to the body's capability to heal itself, right? Which is good. I try to do that as much as possible. But when, my body doesn't heal itself, I go to a medical doctor and I get some medicines and it seems to work most of the time. So that's how I would explain that issue.
Yeah, for sure. Okay.
I was going to say, I think the anti-vax is just right along the same lines as what David was talking about, right? So some people saying that somehow this is a conspiracy to put poisonous substances in your body and control you or to harm you or something like that, when there's a long tradition in medical science showing that it actually vaccines are a good thing, and actually looking at it, even Ellen White was immunized towards the end of her life. So one of the founders of our church saw value in immunizations. It's not like anything; it's not perfect, but boy, it saved a lot of lives through over time.
Yeah. Okay. Let's look at neurolinguistic programming.
NLP. One time I had just been to the eye doctor and my pupils were dilated, so I had to wear my sunglasses to a seminary class. And afterward, the professor called me to the front and he said, do you believe in neurolinguistic programming? And I said, no, I have no idea what this is. He said, well, some years ago, I had students who believed that we were being trained to subtly hypnotize people as a means of persuasion. This was an evangelism class, and they would wear sunglasses to my class to stop this from happening. So neurolinguistic programming was a movement, that I don't remember the exact dates. I think we're talking 80s or something like that. This idea that you could really, reform people's life through hypnosis means and things of this nature. And it came to be, of course, as Adventists, we're skeptical of forms of mind control and those kinds of altered states of consciousness. And then people think, well, how are these professors changing the students' minds on subjects? Well, they must be hypnotizing them, or I don't know how these conspiracy theories start, but that was the idea, right? That seminary professors are training students to go into your churches and hypnotize you so that you will, not be able to be a Seventh-day Adventist anymore, I guess. Yeah, it's kind of wild. But neurolinguistic programming, as a therapy, kind of failed again in the peer review test, right? It didn't work in the control trials that were done.
And this one's a nice one because it's kind of died out, I think, largely. Every once in a while I'll hear some reference to it, but it really was a big controversy, like David said, in the 1980s, and it's kind of gone out of fashion. But I think that makes it kind of a nice example of what we're trying to illustrate here with this point. Of people jumping the gun a little bit on something like this. So
yeah. So another one that comes up every so often that may not be understood initially is, how's this Adventist, or what's the Adventist tie-in, is the moon landing. people look at that and they say, okay, well, what possible connection could this have to the moon landing? And so this is an interesting one to discuss.
Yeah, Rick, I think we've gotten a lot of feedback on this one. At least I have as well, and kind of people scratching their heads. But Ellen White at one point makes a reference how sin will not leave this earth, or words to that effect. And so basically, people have then theorized, well, then therefore a person could not have left the atmosphere, and so the moon landing could not be real, and so therefore has been faked. So giving credence to a larger conspiracy theory, but using specifically Ellen White in a way to, I guess, justify that.
Yeah, there's a subset there.
And that's clearly not what she was talking about, but this is the problem with proof texting, right?
Yeah, sure. Then we have two more, loosely ideologically related and yet not directly. So evolution, evidence faked, and archaeology.
Yeah, so evolution evidence faked. I mean, there were cases in the late 19th, early 20th century of scientists who falsified evidence to supply, their theories of the missing link or embryo development, those kinds of things. But that doesn't mean that, the entire corpus of evidence that people use to build the case for evolution on is faked. We had, an Adventist, how shall we say, a kind of a self-trained geologist, George McCready Price, who denied that there was such a thing as a geological column and those kinds of things. I guess the fact is that there's a lot of evidence that's difficult to explain from a creationist point of view. There's also a lot of evidence that, in my view, is difficult to explain from an evolutionist point of view. And I think that both sides are kind of trying to assemble it and make sense of it as best as they can. And the days of researchers, just inventing things whole cloth seems to be gone. There's just way too much knowledge in the field for that to be a widespread problem for the theory of evolution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Archaeology.
Well, I guess I'll dig in on that one a little bit. Ron Wyatt, who I think more back in the 70s and 80s, basically was going around making these very sensationalized claims to have identified Noah's Ark, where the children of Israel crossed through the sea, all of those different kinds of things, very sensational claims. I actually hadn't heard of the archaeology specific phrase until we were dialoguing together, but I was certainly very familiar with the person, Ron Wyatt, and referring to these very sensational claims. As a general rule, they, by serious archaeologists, since then, there are plausible explanations for most, if not all, of these major discoveries, and none of them actually come one bit closer to actually confirming these grandiose claims that he makes as having discovered. And I know several of our Adventist archaeologists have spent a fair amount of time trying to actually refute that and show people, actually, no, let's not claim that. But yeah, it's just like looking and seeing, oh, I find sulfur on the ground around the Dead Sea, and so therefore that's the site of Sodom and Gomorrah kind of thing. Well, there may be other reasons why there's sulfur on the ground. Just the fact that there's sulfur there is not in itself proof that's where these things happen, so to speak, right?
Yeah. Another one I've heard over and over again is the chariot wheels that were found, at the proposed Red Sea crossing, and of course later on they go and they check, and it turns out to be reef coral. So,
Right. Yeah, and the point here is that there's no cover up, right? There's these are God-fearing Adventist archaeologists, some of the most faithful Adventists I know, right? And their orthodoxy is unimpeachable. I'm sure they would love to find Noah's Ark. In fact, I happen to know that certain of them occasionally go out and try to find Noah's Ark from time to time and see if the theory is going to pan out. Right? They're believers, but they know that they need to be able to demonstrate it to back up the claim, with actual evidence. And so that's the science denial conspiracy here, right? That these are somehow being suppressed by infidels. It's just not the case.
Yeah. I think we missed one here. Bakioki was a Jesuit.
Oh, yeah.
Was he at seminary when you guys were there?
No. He
No,
never
okay.
taught in the seminary. He only taught in the undergraduate program at Andrews, from what I
Well, was he at Andrews? I guess
yeah,
is what I
yeah.
was saying. But he was retired from teaching, but he was still in the area when I was there, so met him a few times, and this was always quite a intriguing thing because he had gone to the uh, uh, to Rome and had studied there at the Pontifical University. So that was again association by guilt by association because he'd gone to a Catholic university. Therefore, he must be some kind of Catholic conspirator. When his dissertation actually is proving quite the opposite and is on the history of the Sabbath. And while some people may disagree with some of his research, in the end and overall, it gives a very solid backing for the historicity of the Sabbath and how the Sabbath changed and so on. So it's very well done work that is it's been critiqued, but it's still overall being fairly well has been well respected, I think. And so this is guilt by association. Although I have to say, Bakioki didn't help his case because he didn't like his regalia from the Pontifical University. It's very drab and black, and so he had a cardinal's robe, brilliant red, dazzling red robe made, and so he used to walk with that into graduation at Andrews, and of course that just kind of stole the show because it was so brilliant, so dazzling in the lights that it was quite impressive. So I think he actually kind of milked it, so to speak, a little bit to just try to draw a little bit of attention from that, but there's been no evidence of that whatsoever. It's again same kind of challenges we've been talking about.
Yeah. We come to our final section now, the most detached from reality, the most unfalsifiable. Let's talk a little bit about that. Of course, unfalsifiable is something that you can neither disprove and therefore neither prove either. So it's in that zone where like you have these suggestions, you have these ideas that maybe in some rare cases some evidence for, but the whole point usually in this category is that it cannot be proven by default.
Yeah,
so
the thing that we hold in our life, that we really believe and hold in our life to be true, that are unfalsifiable, really represent our core beliefs, right? They really are what make us who we are, things that can't be rationally adjudicated and we've just made commitments to. So this is the danger with maybe impossible to refute once accepted, is really that it becomes a part of your identity and takes over your life at a level that can challenge your Christian walk with Jesus as your source of comfort and security in the world.
Yeah, the zone where if you get so focused on some of these things, your Christian and missional potential in many cases may tank. I've seen that over and over.
If I'm hearing you guys right, it kind of requires almost like a leap of faith that in the end, once you're committed to it, leads to almost like an obsession. Is that fair to say?
You can.
Yeah, or a very core commitment, right? Like this is why it can cause offshoots, because you're more committed to this than you are to your Adventist faith in some cases, or it comes into conflict with it. And these things can also destroy your well-being, as we've noted as well, right? Things that can really cause you to make serious moves in your life that could harm the well-being of yourself and those around you, right? Because people will go to the stake, right, for their faith. So let's make sure it's something that we can back up from the Bible and from historical evidence, I think would be my appeal in this category, and not something that simply fills a meaning deficit in my life, to borrow a term from the other video I did on this.
Yeah. So one of the first critiques that I saw in the comments on this was concerning the Luciferian elites around the world. And the question had to do along the lines of, don't we believe in a great controversy and principalities and powers in high places? What do we mean by this, and how do we relate it to this category?
Yeah, and I think the challenge here is that in a lot of conspiracy preaching I hear, people want to treat the great controversy as if it were the grand conspiracy that unites all other conspiracies. But when you go into history and look at the sources of, for example, the great apostasy, a lot of it is happening with people operating from the best of motives, right? People whose Christian experience, by all accounts, is really unimpeachable, the farthest from devil worshippers that you can find. So I don't think that the great controversy requires that everybody be in on the conspiracy. The devil has his ways of working through history that we don't know about. God has his ways of working through history that we don't know about. And our job is to remain faithful to God in as much as we possibly can. And, speculating about the false motives of other people really seems to be the devil's work in the great controversy, right? When you go to the book of Job, for example, it's all about questioning motives. That's what Satan does. Let's not question motives, even of the elites who run the world, right? Unless we have good evidence to back it up.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. The next one down there is secret organizations use Hegelian dialectics to control history.
I'll turn that to you, David.
Yeah, I guess this one falls to me as well. I've seen this a few places around Adventism. Hegelian dialectics is a way of reasoning from opposites through to a kind of compromise position that moves beyond them, right? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And in Hegel's philosophy of history, this can come to be a way of explaining how history makes progress toward an eventual outcome. So if you've ever subscribed to the kind of pendulum theory of history, right, where first politics will swing to the right, and then there'll be a reaction that will swing to the left, but each time we progress, that's Hegelian dialectics, right? And the idea is that secret organizations can take control of Hegelian dialectics to promote the outcome they want, right? So if we want to move things toward the right side of politics, we'll strengthen the left and provoke a reaction against them and those kinds of things. It's interesting to note that, the politician who seems to toy around with this the most is actually Vladimir Putin. Has some of his advisors who will sort of send funds to organizations that seem to be in opposition to them and things like this. But it doesn't really seem to move their history forward. All it does is create confusion about what exactly their government wants and destabilizes things enough that he can remain in power. But when it comes to historical cause and effect, you really need to look at causes that are commensurate to the effect that you're observing. And secret organizations, pumping some money and influence into a certain direction to provoke an opposite reaction, that hasn't been demonstrated and is really almost impossible to refute because the evidence isn't there. But once you start to see reality that way, you can sort of interpret everything through that lens.
Yeah. The Pope's address to U.S. Congress would usher in the Sunday law.
Well, I got to jump in again on this one because my son came home from a Sabbath school class, I won't say from which church, telling me that his teacher had told the students that this was the case, right? I don't know if you remember, this happened back in, I think, 2015. And yeah, he came home that's the Sabbath after that had happened and said, yeah, it's our teacher told us this is coming, right? But the fact is it didn't happen, right? And so then does that make my son more or less likely to believe whatever I may have to tell him about Revelation 13, right? That's what I worry about with these kinds of things, right? It's once you've been through enough of the, hype, right? Does it seem more or less plausible that there will be a final crisis over the Sabbath? I worry that this, it gins up excitement at the moment, but I think it's detrimental to faith.
Yeah. So we're not denying the fact that, there are grand movements of history that occur towards, an end that we eschatologically teach and believe.
Yeah.
But it's just the sensationalizing of them to say, this is it, we're here, and maybe even some date setting there as well in some rare cases.
Right.
Yeah. This is where we run into trouble. It seems like every conflict, World War I, World War II, people start jumping the gun and start saying, oh, this is the end. And if you say that too loud, it's like the crying out about wolf, wolf. And then when it actually is the end and Jesus is coming, no one's going to believe you because every other time you cried wolf. So there's something to be said for that. And there's always a little bit of truth, like the Pope addressed Congress, but that happened. But obviously there were no Sunday laws. In fact, that isn't even what the Pope was talking about. So.
Yeah, not to get on too much of a soapbox, but I often feel like we get so focused on the events that we forget our mission. we use the events as an excuse to mark where we're at, so that at the very last moment we can jump back to our mission and say, okay, we need to finish up what God's called us to do. Meanwhile, all the time before that, we've been, waiting for the headlines to give us our marching orders. So sometimes we get distracted. Flat Earth theory.
All right. Well, I'll dig on this one. Yeah, we've had this challenge for a long time. Where some people have tried to argue that the Earth is flat. All the way back in the 1890s, there was a man by the name of Alexander Gleason who's basically writing about this theory. And Ellen White is all the way back then cautioning, basically expressing concern. Her main concern is that if you read the letter carefully, that you not dwell on something more or less, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but basically sensational. Instead, the real focus, as you were just talking, Eric, needs to be on our mission and spreading the message. And she does give a hint that, there's potential of losing credibility or words along those lines. So there needs to be some caution and care. In fact, she's cautioning him not to publish a book on that topic. Well, he obviously didn't listen and did, in fact, publish that book. And so it's a curious thing that throughout Adventist history, we've seen different people that have tried to argue that the Earth is flat. But this is pretty problematic, especially if we are also a church that believes in a global mission. And we've got to reach the whole world, which, I've been around the world several times, flying literally all the way around, and made it back to the same place. So it's this very intriguing thing that we've had to deal with that involves a real commitment to an ideology to really jump to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, we have another here. Ellen White's writings are altered or suppressed.
Well, I might bite on this one too. I was an intern at the Ellen G. White estate at the General Conference back in the 1990s, and I was always amazed that they gave a key and the combination to the vault to a young teenage boy. And so I had fun. My job was to each summer produce a full set of the unpublished writings of Ellen White. So I had free access, and I used to have people asking me, so where did they keep the secret writings? And so I, is it under the stairs? Well, I found out where all the stuff was stored. And I mean, I wasn't looking for any secret writings. I was just having fun being an exuberant teenager who loves Adventist history and Ellen White. And what I can tell you is that the church has gone to great pains to actually the opposite. But if you want to believe that there is some kind of conspiracy and that they've been somehow altered, I guess the other part of this is that Ellen White had literary assistants that helped her. And so the part of the conspiracy is then therefore these people had some kind of nefarious influence that controlled and suppressed her writings or changed her writings. And a good example of this is the Trinity. Some of Ellen White's strongest statements, which is also one of these other topics up here in this same chart, that those words that are pushing the church into a strong Trinitarianism effectively were nefariously planted into her writings, like in the statement about Christ's life being unborrowed, underived, and Desire of Ages that's so famous. And I had a good friend that went back through the handwritten originals and found it in Ellen White's own handwriting itself. And so while we don't always have handwritten autographs for all of her writings, at least when it comes to some of her strongest Trinitarian statements, it's, I think, very useful to help illustrate at least that although she had literary assistants that helped her in her writing and producing it and typing it up and even editing it, make sure it's punctuated and everything else, Ellen White always retained control, intellectual control of the production of what came out under her pen. And so I think that's a very important and significant difference.
All right, we're nearing the last few here. So we have a couple. Let's start with Islam controlled by the Catholics, and then we'll look at the president signing the Sunday law.
Yeah, Islam controlled by the Catholics is one that a certain popular conspiracy preacher seems to have really pushed out there. And yeah, we do know that there were, various religious influences operating on Muhammad. His Christian sources seem, however, not to have been Orthodox Christians like the Catholics were, because some of the stuff that he's reacting against doesn't jive with that. But again, the kind of fact of a historical association way back when, it doesn't result in a kind of control that we're talking about here, as if the two religions are coordinating in some way under the control of the devil and all of this kind of stuff, right? There's no evidence for, the diabolical, if you will, workings there. And beyond that, I would say, again, we need to go back to the question of historical cause and effect, right? When you're looking at historical effects, are you able to document and demonstrate that there are causes commensurate to them that explain them? And so it's just something that is very impossible, I think, to refute once accepted, if you're willing to use that kind of historical methodology.
Yeah. Then we also have the president has secretly signed the Sunday law.
Yeah, a meme that goes around Adventist social media circles every how many years, right? And it just gins up sensation and excitement, and people play around with it a little bit. Again, I don't know if it's something that even could be refuted, because I don't know how seriously that kind of thing gets taken. It's just sort of ooh, wouldn't it be cool if, kind of feeling that comes over you, or wouldn't it be exciting maybe, and every time it happens, it seems to just, that effect seems to wear off right? Again and again, and then finally you go, well, is this ever really going to take place? And that's what I worry about, is that final feeling.
Yeah, we could just get so used to that sensationalism that when the time comes that we really need to be awake, we're asleep. David Gates, futurism.
Okay, I see Michael smiling, so I guess I need to walk into this one again.
I'll let you take this one.
Okay. Yeah, we tried to stay away from naming names on this chart because it wasn't about personalities. But on this point, there really is no other way to talk about it, because his version of Adventist futurism is so idiosyncratic. But it's basically an attempt to correlate Bible prophecies with events that have happened within the last few decades or so, in order to demonstrate that Jesus is going to return within a certain time window. And therefore you need to sell everything and give to the gospel cause and move to the country now and that kind of stuff. It's conspiratorial because it does incorporate some of these kinds of conspiracy theories, that this event was really about this and that event was really about that. And so the prophetic correlations don't really have publicly verified evidence to back them up. And as well, it's futurism, it's date setting. There's a host of theological problems with that, and for that reason, he was his credentials were taken away by the Adventist Church, so I think maybe we could talk about him in that sense as well. Name the name. It is an offshoot. I maybe a bit unfair to say like Koresh, because he doesn't seem to have all the other problems that Koresh had. But that's where that's at. I don't know if any of you have anything to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think you're right. And I would just add again what you said. We're not trying to name names, but we are trying to be sensitive to the fact that this is an area where there's a lot of concern, right? So we want to be very pastoral and redemptive in how we're approaching this, but yeah, it kind of takes a jump, a leap, once you actually start going down this path, and it's kind of hard to come back from that.
And last but not least, we have kind of a bucket catch-all topic. It's the top right: apostasy from the pioneers' doctrine. Two of them we mentioned. Of course, there could be any number of subsets here, but anti-Trinitarianism and the 2520 as relating to this theme.
well, maybe I'll start a little brief stab, and David can help me out here, and Eric. But the one of the big concerns I think a lot of people have is that somehow the earliest Adventist pioneers were anti-Trinitarian, so therefore we should be anti-Trinitarian. So, which I find is a very interesting appeal, because you're appealing to tradition, which is in itself that's not Adventist, that's kind of Catholic. As Adventists, we've always adhered to the belief in progressive revelation, present truth, the idea that we can and should grow in our understanding of truth. What I find most interesting is I've been doing some recent research in the last couple of years on this, is that our pioneers were not so solidly anti-Trinitarian as a lot of people would think. For example, our early Adventist hymnals, even the Millerite hymnals, were solidly Trinitarian. They just didn't like the word Trinity because of its Catholic association. But for example, the doxology, praise Father, Son, Holy Ghost, that's in all of our earliest Adventist hymnals, all the way back to 1849 with James Wyatt. So they clearly believed in the divinity of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. What is interesting to me is that in the 1870s and 1880s, there began to be a lot of questions, especially by Uriah Smith and a few of our key thinkers in the denomination, that led to really kind of reevaluating our Christology, how we view Christ. Was he created at some point? Was he not? Which ultimately, by the whole 1888 saga, was resolved itself into a strong affirmation of the full Godhead, the full divinity of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, and all three persons, divine persons of the Godhead. And eventually we come around and realize just because you use the word Trinity doesn't mean that you're using it the same way the Catholics do or anything else like that. So gradually through the 20th century, that's become a very accepted term once again within Adventism. So, but this idea that, oh, we're in apostasy because we're not living the same way as our pioneers. Well, I immediately respond, well, our earliest pioneers, they ate pork. That's not something that becomes accepted, our understanding of clean and unclean foods, until about the same time as our understanding of the Trinity effectively. And you look at William Miller. I mean, he loved to smoke, and he's studying the Bible and the prophecies. It's not the image we like to think of with William Miller, but he liked to have his tobacco there and would smoke. And but we don't fault him for that, simply because we also acknowledge he made a contribution to the Adventist message and Bible prophecy. And yet at the same time, we acknowledge he's a human being, and that the church has moved beyond where he personally was. And so that kind of mentality, we have to be careful where we're coming from as we approach these different kinds of topics. But if you just believe, oh, that's proof that everything's been covered up because I can find someone in Adventist history that believes something the same way I do. Well, did they have good reason for it? What was their evidence? What's the story of what's going on in the story and the development of our church? Have our pioneers changed their views, and was there a good reason why? And the Trinity is a really good example of a theological important belief that took some time for our pioneers to really sort out and wrestle with.
Yeah, sometimes it's easy to read history from a perspective of finality, where we forget that even we ourselves go through a growth in thought, almost an evolution in thought, but a growth in thought, where we come from a primitive understanding as children, it develops further. We might even switch sides, back and forth throughout our lives. And this is what happened to our pioneers in many cases. I remember going into the vault at Andrews University because I wanted to see a copy of the letter by M.L. Andreasen after he went to Ellen White to view some of her writings from the Desire of Ages and elsewhere, because he just couldn't believe that she would write something that sounded so Trinitarian. He goes, he finds it, and he's so impacted by it that he writes a testimony saying, wow, this caused me to reevaluate everything I thought previously about, being hesitant towards this Trinitarian concept. So, we all have developments of thought, and we need to allow that as you read our history as well.
Yeah, and I would simply say on that point that the conspiratorial connection here is the idea that this original teaching has somehow been like intentionally suppressed, right? That language has been altered in Ellen White's writings, that things have been done. It seems to go along with a general suspicion of church authority, right? Often people who have been let down by, those who are supposed to be teaching in the church, or who have just taken a disagreement with the church's leading theological lights, seem to then say, well, then what else are they hiding from me? And anti-Trinitarianism seems to come in along those lines. And I should also note that anti-Trinitarianism is a very big catch-all term, right? There are lots of nuances to the positions that are held in this venue.
Yeah. Very good. Well, that's pretty much the whole chart. So I hope this has been informative and educational, and maybe there's some things that you have learned in the process as you've joined watching us. But we pray that this would be something that helps us move forward in our lives, realizing that there are 1,000 ways to be distracted from what God is calling us to do, and yet He's given each and every one of us a mission and an opportunity to share light and truth and the things that are truly valuable for our time. And sometimes even for myself, there are some topics that I like to just dabble in. It intrigues one to say, well, what if this was true? But at the end of the day, I have to bring myself back to that place where I'm saying, what is it that God wants me to do right now, though? Because sometimes we can get so caught up in a hobby or a topic that it becomes all encompassing. And that's the place that we really want to avoid, unless, of course, that's Jesus, the Christ, the cross, and Him crucified, right? So, yeah, any other final thoughts?
Let me just say on the 2520, the challenge there is an umbrella view of Ellen White's inspiration, that she could cover other things with her own inspiration through endorsement. And that just happens out to be the case. It's about the 1843 prophecy chart, for those who are wondering. But the issues are all the same as with anti-Trinitarianism, as we just discussed. Thank you so much, Eric, for hosting us and pitching in your 2 cents. Thank you, Dr. Campbell, for agreeing to come on and do this together with me. This has been, an interesting project, to say the least.
It kind of surprised me how all this has kind of come together, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, I would add, those that listen, we'd love your feedback. We'd love to know if you have some other ideas of things you would add, or we actually released some earlier versions of this chart, right? And thanks to some very constructive feedback, we've actually been able to hone and refine this, and I think improve this chart so that it will be a useful tool to reflect upon as to. Like Eric said, we want to keep our focus on our mission, what we're all about, and not allow ourselves to be ultimately distracted from that mission, and to better understand those kinds of things and the reasons why, so that we can be, again, better focused on Jesus and finishing the work that He's given us.
Yeah, by no means is this intended to be the last word on the subject, or we're not trying to speak from any position of positional authority. It's simply offering a framework for you to think about these issues and populating it with some examples. And hopefully this can get some necessary conversations going when and where you need them.
We should have started with a disclaimer. The opinions and things expressed herein are not reflective of our employers or anyone other than ourselves.
Right. That's right. It's just our own personal views. But again, hopefully it's helpful to those that see the chart, and it's been a fun collaborative project. I've really enjoyed working with the both of you, and look forward to getting more feedback and as we continue to reflect on this topic.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, guys. It's been a blessing.
All right. God bless, gentlemen. We will hopefully have another chance to talk soon.